My name is Dr. Christy Webb, and I'm a psychologist in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Some of my viewers have asked for a video on the genetics of borderline personality disorder, so that's what this one is about. Historically, the explanation for borderline personality disorder, or BPD, was that something went wrong between the ages of 18 and 36 months, that time when a child is learning to separate from, usually, mom, to be an individual. Instead of developing healthy boundaries, me, not me, the child became enmeshed with the caregiver, leading to the characteristics of BPD: frantic attempts to avoid real or imagined abandonment, chaotic interpersonal relationships, and an inability to regulate their own emotions because they relied on the adult to regulate for them. Then, as Marsha Linehan was developing dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, in the 80s and 90s, she proposed the biosocial theory of what causes borderline personality disorder. That states that folks with BPD are born emotionally sensitive. They arrive on the planet already prone to rapid changes of emotions, difficulty regulating emotions, and difficulty tolerating distress. But if they're born that way, why doesn't anyone teach them the skills that most children are taught? Why doesn't anyone teach them to tolerate distress, how to make and keep friends, how to smooth out their emotions? Well, according to the biosocial theory, people who develop BPD are often brought up in situations that are invalidating. That is, there's a poor fit between them and their caregivers, so they're criticized for being exactly who they are, emotionally sensitive. They're told that there's no reason for them to be sad, or are told not to get angry. They may even be punished for having intense emotions. Now, this is not to blame the caregivers. It's entirely possible that they never learned these skills either. But the combination of the child's biology with the invalidating social environment creates BPD, according to Marsha Linehan and the biosocial theory. It's nature and nurture. For the past 15 or so years, research is being done on the role that our genes play in someone having BPD. So let's first look at what has been learned and then try to understand why the results are not all that robust. Research suggests that borderline personality disorder is the result of a combination of genetic, biological, and environmental factors. So nature plus nurture, just as we've thought. Heritability was estimated at 46%, so genetics accounts for just under half of the reason why someone has BPD. So far, 2 specific genes are thought to contribute to BPD, but researchers aren't sure how they do it. These 2 genes are also linked to other mental illnesses, including bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, and schizophrenia. So why do they lead to BPD in one person and schizophrenia in another person? We don't know yet. BPD does show up in families. It's an argument for a genetic contribution. But estimates of risk in first-degree relatives, that is, those are the folks who are most genetically like you, they range widely from just under 1% to just over 18%. That's a big spread. That is to say, if you have borderline personality disorder, your identical twin has between a 1 times and 18 times greater likelihood of also having BPD than your non-twin sibling does. But if heritability is 46%, why doesn't your identical twin have the same chance of having BPD as you do? And interestingly, only certain traits were found to be inherited, mostly quick-changing feelings and interpersonal chaos. I said that BPD seems to come from a combination of genetic, biological, and environmental factors. What's the difference between genetic and biological? Well, when we say biology, we're talking about differences in brain development. BPD has been linked to the amygdala and the hippocampus of the brain. They are deep inside your brain. Studies have shown that the hippocampus and amygdala may be as much as 16% smaller in people with BPD than in those without that diagnosis. These are both primitive parts of the brain. The hippocampus is partly responsible for memory and learning, while the amygdala is in charge of fear and stress reactions, especially the fight, flight, or freeze response. There's a lot of trauma documented in folks with BPD, and it's possible that traumatic experiences is what led to those differences in brain size. So we're not sure, is it effect or cause? Studies on the brains of people with BPD also show slow processing of glucose by the brain. The theory here is that BPD results from a failure of the rational prefrontal cortex to regulate the impulsive lizard brain or limbic system where the hippocampus and amygdala are found. That sounds like adolescence, right? Because the prefrontal cortex has not yet developed. DBT would say that emotion mind overwhelms rational mind because of this slow processing of a chemical by the brain. Now let's look at what makes this so hard to research. And there are lots of factors. Different research methods is a big one. Some studies only look at one symptom, say impulsivity, and they ignore the others, but that runs the risk of collecting data that may miss some insight. There's also no objective test for BPD, so some researchers use a clinical interview, others use a self-rating questionnaire, or they gather information indirectly from family members and partners. So different methodologies most likely explains much of the variability that researchers get. Small studies, which these often are, produce less robust results. Consequently, there is considerable uncertainty regarding the heritability of BPD through our genes. It's also super hard to locate someone who only has BPD and no other diagnosis. One analysis found that nearly 96% of individuals diagnosed with BPD had at least one other psychiatric diagnosis. The most common comorbid disorders, as we call them, were anxiety disorders, followed by mood disorders, and then substance use disorders. When we study folks who have BPD along with comorbid disorders, it's more difficult to say that results are caused by a single disease. But maybe it's not even possible for someone to have BPD without comorbid depression and anxiety, given the distress, emotion regulation difficulties, and interpersonal stresses that these people have. I did say that there's an environmental piece, so let's take a moment to understand that. There is no specific environmental risk factor that's been declared a cause of BPD. Shared family environmental factors, such as socioeconomic status, they don't seem to contribute substantially to the development of BPD. But very interestingly, some researchers think it's important to study gene times environment interactions in order to understand what causes BPD. This is what Linehan was getting at when she proposed the biosocial theory, that some babies are born with a genetic predisposition to BPD and something in their family environment triggers the disorder to manifest. In a different family, the same child might not develop it. Finally, a word about gender bias. Borderline personality disorder is diagnosed far more frequently in women than in men. Maybe more women really do have the disorder, or maybe it's the way the symptom criteria are written that seems to pathologize women's behavior. In any case, researchers point out that since it is harder to find men who meet criteria for BPD, and I do have a video on that topic, generalization of their findings about the genetic contribution to BPD in men should be done very cautiously. Questions about the causes of mental disorders are fascinating. Unfortunately, the answers are not all that clear. It does seem to be the case, though, that borderline personality disorder can be inherited, at least in some cases where the genes meet a specific type of environment. Thanks so much for watching.